Why does anything matter? It's an indisputable fact that many things do matter to us. What we have for breakfast, the well-being of our loved ones, geopolitics. But the question that we're faced with isn't whether or not we care about these things, but whether there are good reasons for us to care about them, or indeed about anything at all. This question has traditionally been the province of religion and theology, but after the collapse of theistic metaphysics, we're forced to look elsewhere. My aim in this talk will be to clarify the question, reject some possible answers, and to sketch the outline of an alternative. So first of all, we might ask, what does mattering mean? We say that many different types of things matter in a variety of different ways. On the one hand, we talk about how actions matter. By using the language of directives, we say that we should, ought, may or may not perform them. So for example, one ought not to steal. On the other, we talk about how objects or states matter. By using the language of evaluatives, saying that they are good, bad, better and worse than one another. So for example, saying that renewable energy is better than fossil fuels. To put this in different terms, we can distinguish between norms governing action and value ascribed to things that we act upon. These two perspectives are to some extent interchangeable. To say that one painting is better than another appears to imply that, all else being equal, if you can save one from the flames, you ought to choose the former. And it seems natural to say that when you're obliged to sacrifice one life for the sake of 10, this implies that the outcome is more important than the alternative. There have been various attempts to reduce one way of talking to the other. Although there are various technical difficulties involved in doing this that I don't really want to go into, I'd suggest giving explanatory priority to directives and norms over evaluatives and value, simply because they enable us to make explicit the connection between value and action. So amounts of value don't simply describe intensities of feeling, but rather degrees of motivation for performing certain actions. In essence, the purpose of both ways of talking is to organise our reasons for action, so that we may work through conflicts between these reasons. They effectively encode patterns of practical reasoning. There are two useful distinctions that reveal how this encoding works in practice, or at least aspects of how it works in practice. On the one hand, we can distinguish between positive and negative reasons. From the perspective of value, these end up being somewhat symmetrical, so reasons to seek or avoid certain outcomes that can cancel one another out, like quantities. For example, quantities of pleasure and pain. From the perspective of norms, these appear more asymmetrical, so we can distinguish between the purposes motivating particular actions from constraints that limit permissible actions. So for example, producing a product that people will enjoy, but not employing slave labour in doing so. Right? One is a kind of positive aim, the other is a negative constraint upon how aims can be achieved. Now, on the other hand, we can distinguish between absolute and relative reasons. From the perspective of norms, this is a matter of conditionality. Reasons to do something regardless of all other considerations, or alternatively, only if or unless certain conditions hold. So, for example, on the one hand, we might say you shouldn't kill under any circumstances, or we might say you shouldn't kill unless it's in self-defense. Most practical reasoning is massively conditional, right? It involves a lot of potential exceptions. And this is something that's anticipated by using ceteris paribus clauses, or saying you should do something all else being equal, right? Now, from the perspective of value, this distinction between absolute and relative becomes a matter of typology. So, on the one hand, we can distinguish the goodness of states simpliciter, right, in terms of which every outcome is comparable. So we might say that we want to achieve the best possible world, right, from various types of value that get ascribed to specific objects and states. So, for example, wisdom, justice, or utility, right? Each of which motivate different sorts of action. So, learning, coercion, or acquisition, respectively. These also permit extensive and fine-grained comparisons between different actions and states without necessarily thereby being mutually comparable. So you can't necessarily compare wisdom, justice, and utility, for instance. So, that sort of preamble out the way, we might ask, what if nothing matters? Right? So Nietzsche famously diagnosed an emerging nihilism within European culture, precipitated by what he described as the death of God. So he argued that divine authority functioned as the foundation of the systems of value implicit within European culture, and that rejection of this authority was causing those systems to slowly unravel. His thought of eternal return, the idea that we must live as if the entire world would be repeated in an indefinite cycle, was meant to function as something like a test for any system of value that might survive this ungrounding and so replace systems dependent upon divine authority. Following Ray Brassier, I propose a different test, the thought of extinction. This is the idea that we must live as if the universe may simply cease to exist at some point, taking intelligent life and all of its achievements with it. This is not an apocalypse, an unveiling that would make sense of everything that came before it, but a sudden nothingness, a truly meaningless end. The thought of extinction undermines any and every purpose we might ascribe to the universe itself, whether we conceive of it either as a perpetual machine in which everything, ourselves included, has a role, or as a grand narrative building towards cosmic apotheosis. Extinction ensures the frustration of every such design, unravelling its components from annihilation backwards. More than anything, extinction invalidates any system of value predicated upon survival, be it an appeal to evolutionary fitness or the recognition of some future posterity. One response to this challenge is to follow Kant, denying the authority of norms imposed upon us from without in the name of norms that we legislate for ourselves. However, such approaches tend to abstract away from the goals we might set from ourselves in favour of articulating absolute constraints upon them. This threatens to leave us with an empty form of justice, with reasons not to do many things, but no reason to do anything in particular. Thomas Ligotti's antinatalism provides an interesting response to such positions. He argues that our existence is malignantly useless. The very fact that we are able to search for a purpose for our existence without ever finding one makes this existence objectively worse than the alternative. Any subjective value derived from feelings of pleasure or fulfillment is essentially ephemeral as far as he's concerned, because such feelings can wither away for no reason whatsoever. We may delude ourselves that life is more than meaningless suffering, but the hard truth is that we should really welcome extinction. So how do we resist this Ligottian conclusion? Well, we might ask, what about desire? Why not desire as a justification here? So, opposed to the mere constraints supplied by Kantianism, utilitarianism aims to articulate a positive purpose, namely the maximisation of happiness, conceived as an absolute value. The strategy here is to articulate an end that all our desires aim at by abstracting away from their specific content, treating what we want as really a means to the end of pleasure or satisfaction. The problem with this strategy is that it distorts the nature of desire. On the one hand, hedonic utilitarianism, which prioritises the feeling of pleasure, fails to appreciate the intentionality of desire, or the fact that we want what we want, not the feeling of getting it. Not only does this make various specific things that we want fungible with regard to amounts of homogeneous pleasure, but it fails to account for things that don't result in pleasure, or worse, which can't, such as outcomes that occur after our deaths. On the other hand, Preference utilitarianism, which prioritizes the satisfaction of our avowed preferences, overdetermines the intentionality of desire, effectively insisting that we just want what we want and nothing more. It fails to account for the fact that we often don't know what we want, and that this epistemic opacity is productive, driving us to discover new objects of desire. It fails to appreciate that not only do avowed preferences change, but that they can evolve for reasons that are intrinsic to them. So, in essence, the means-ends reversal at the heart of utilitarianism undermines the possibility of doing things for their own sake, which means for reasons that are specific to them, our appreciation of which can change and deepen over time. So, for example, if one aims to write a novel for its own sake, one's understanding of what's involved in doing that might change as one does it, as one learns more about writing in practice. That's different from writing a novel in order to be a famous author, where what this involves is fixed by social factors that are fundamentally external to the craft of writing itself. So, what distinguishes ends from means is the way in which their content is open to progressive determination. Now, the difficulty here lies in reconciling the fact that we get to determine what we want for ourselves with the fact that we often have reasons to choose one way or another. In essence, we must explain how we can think that some things are worthy of wanting. So, why not beauty? It's important to clarify that what I mean by beauty here is not a quality such as prettiness, but a type of value akin to but distinct from justice. It's the type of value we ascribe to works of art and other aesthetic phenomena when we say that they are good, bad, better, or worse than one another, though it's not necessarily restricted to them. It's what's at stake in debates about aesthetics, which, though they may not be objective in the same manner as mathematics or natural science, are not for that matter entirely subjective either. It's clear that there are such things as differences in personal taste, but this doesn't mean that all aesthetic disagreements are reducible to them. This is what Kant would call subjective universality. Crucially, although beauty admits of comparison, these comparisons are often partial and rarely absolute. So the idea of a best possible artwork seems incoherent. Right? A painting by Matisse may be neither better nor worse than a poem by Mallarmé. A song by Led Zeppelin may be better than one by Black Sabbath qua blues, but maybe not qua rock. Even when works are comparable, there's rarely a singular dimension underpinning our rankings, as if simply making a song longer, louder, or lower in pitch would always make it better, but a melange of different factors that cohere to make one thing superior, the balance of which isn't obvious in advance. In this respect, various arts resemble nothing so much as research programs, progressively uncovering vectors of improvement, branching into parallel paths, and articulating partial criteria of comparison as they go. Within aesthetic contexts, we come to appreciate that there are things that we should want. Not in the sense that we should all desire exactly the same things, but rather that our particular combination of preferences give us reasons to explore certain options. For example, a preference for Black Sabbath may suggest you should listen to Earth, or even to refine your tastes in particular ways. For example, that you should learn to appreciate longer and slower riffs. The pursuit of beauty is not restricted to some specific experiential qualities like prettiness or pleasantness or sublimity, but is more generally concerned with varieties of excellence. It uncovers wants that transcend our needs, even as we keep redefining the boundaries between these. From this perspective, aesthetic investigates the evolution of coherent preferences. There are plenty of ways of going wrong, plenty of ways of developing incoherent wants. Even if there's no singular way to be right. So, what distinguishes this unfolding process of proliferating ends from the fixed systems of purposes embodied in the universe considered as a machine or as a narrative is that the value of each step isn't premised upon a consequent actuality, for example, survival or apotheosis, but on its relation to a range of possibilities, so the new alternatives and improvements that these steps suggest. The value of every song we sing is framed not only by comparison with other songs we could have sung, but with the songs we might now sing, regardless of whether we do in fact or not. There's no intrinsic limit to this expanding horizon of freedom to act, this growing set of options for pursuing excellence, and yet the significance of its growth isn't erased if it's halted from without. Right? Extinction doesn't fundamentally remove its worth. However, the beauty of each specific thing, which may give us reason to care about it, is still essentially relative to the desires we have and the choices we make, even if it's not simply determined by them. The question remains whether we can derive some sort of absolute value from this way of thinking about things. So, why not freedom itself? So it's important to understand that freedom isn't simply the absence of constraint upon action, or what you might call liberty, but also the possession of capacity and motivation, or what you might call agency. This much is crystal clear in the context of games, where the rules determining permissible action and their consequences are distinct from the goals that motivate play, right? So you're not required to checkmate someone, right? You're motivated to try and find a set of rules, a set of moves that will let you do it, if we're considering chess. However, games are microcosms of freedom of such. They're worlds within a world, and though it's clear that there are things that we should care about with any given game, like we should care about potential ways in which our own king might be checked, for instance, right? This is conditional upon our choosing to play. We don't choose to be born into the world as such, and it isn't obvious we can treat the world as if it were one great game. However, this does give us one way of reframing the problem with Kantian approaches. They establish absolute constraints that are practically necessary, or what we might say obligatory, but then leave everything else equally practically possible, or permissible, right? They give us, on this basis, they give us no account of practical contingency, or that which we have reason to do, even though there's no ultimate ground from which these reasons derive. Right? Something we have reason to do, but for which the reason isn't necessary. This suggests that, in the practical domain, beauty is to justice as contingency is to necessity. Right? By contrast, this means that the problem with utilitarian approaches is that they actually collapse the difference between these two types of value, collapsing the difference between beauty and justice in a way that enforces mandatory excellence on a cosmic scale. Now, this insight offers up a curious possibility, that not only is the ultimate groundlessness of our desires not a complete absence of all reason, but that this groundlessness might be distinctively valuable in its own right. To put this in different terms, we might suggest that what is most beautiful is the existence of beauty itself, or the ongoing flourishing of freedom in which it subsists. To translate this into the analogy with games, the great game of life consists in finding smaller games to play. The only absolute value lies in the pursuit of relative ones. This then would be a suitable answer to our question. It's not true that just anything can matter, but it's equally false that what matters does so necessarily, independent of our choices. the only thing that matters necessarily is that something must matter. And this means that no matter who we are or what we want, we should care about the freedom of ourselves and others, and promote its unconstrained evolution. In fact, the only thing that should constrain freedom is itself. And this is the true content of justice, right? It is a means to the end of beauty, even if it must sometimes override it. Ethics without aesthetics is empty, but aesthetics without ethics is blind.